Now for our main speaker. Kimberly Strassel, member of the Wall Street Journal Editorial Board, author of the weekly column, the Potomac Watch, and is a New York Times best-selling author as well. Ms. Strassel appears frequently as a commentator on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and is a Fox News contributor as well. Ms. Strassel comes to us all the way from Anchorage, Alaska, where she lives. Where she lives with her husband, Nicholas, who is with us today. Nicholas, are you in the room? Happy to have you here. Yeah, and anyway, Washington is talking about notorious ideas today. A shift that bodes well for the body politic. She will be happy to sign any books you might have, not by Shakespeare and William Butler Yeats, but her own books, of course, on her own. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome her as she speaks about bringing big back to the Beltway. Kimberly Strassel.
Okay, I'm gonna just fix this for a second. Is it still working? Yeah, all right, okay. Hello, how is everybody doing? Good, by the way, it's really hot here. It is such an honor to be here. I have always loved the idea of the Chautauqua Institution, the notion that we should always be learning, we should always be striving to better ourselves. And I really want to salute advocates for balance at Chautauqua, all of you in the audience, for embodying one of the main spirits behind that principle, especially when it comes to political discussion, which is that if we want to grow and we want to progress, we have to hear from all sides. Diversity of ideas is what got me into this business in the first place, the idea that we only progress as a country if we have civil and civic debate all the time. And so to the extent that this organization exists to make that happen, I applaud all of you, applaud all of you. And I want to thank Paul and I want to thank Susan for making our trip here so welcoming. We have had the best 2 days since we have been here. I had no idea what Chautauqua looked like. I'm a little bit of an architecture buff, so you can imagine what it was like when I walked in here. Also, just a word as to how honored I was to get to speak here. It is practically impossible to get an Alaskan to leave Alaska in the summer. You know, we lived through 9 months of Arctic temperatures, and when we finally get sunshine and growing weather and the fishing season, nothing makes us leave. This is the first event I have ever agreed to do in the summer since I moved there 8 years ago. So that's how special you all are. We are going to leave some real time at the end of this talk to go through all the day-to-day that is happening in Washington. And by the way, given this administration, probably that will all have changed by the time I finish talking up here today. But we can talk about the Israeli and Iranians, the strikes on Iran, the big beautiful bill, the state of the Democratic Party. But given that I had an opportunity to be up here with you for a solid moment, and because this is Chautauqua, I wanted instead to address something that is really important that is happening in Washington, something that I would argue is a lot bigger than that day-to-day, even though it often encompasses some of that day-to-day. And something that, and I don't get to say this very often, is extremely exciting and very good for the future of this country. And that is this. We are seeing something happen in DC that hasn't happened since I was a rookie writer at the Wall Street Journal. And by the way, that was many moons ago. I am not as old as the Chautauqua Institution, but sometimes covering this administration, I feel as old as the Chautauqua Institution, just the pace of it. We are having serious discussions about serious issues in DC. Not just policy questions, but fundamental questions about really big debates about the structure and nature of the working of the federal government, the separation of powers, federalism, the role DC is playing by comparison to the states, the dangers of an unchecked bureaucracy, America's role in the world. We have not done serious in DC for a very, very long time, and for a whole host of reasons. And if you listen to what I would argue is the incredibly simplistic and naive argument for why we don't do anything big in Washington anymore, the word you always hear is polarization. But that's not it. Yes, we are very polarized as a country, but that is a symptom of our problem. It is not the cause. The cause is something much bigger. The cause is government itself, a government that has succumbed to a whole host of structural and human problems over the years. Structurally, we have things like gerrymandering and the lack of term limits, and an entire generation of DC politicians that no longer do the job. And you guys see these people all the time. They never have to worry about anything but being reelected. Many of them don't even have to worry about that because they have such a lock on their districts. We've also had the rise of cable TV, 24-hour news, social media, and it's led a lot of politicians to believe that their only job in Washington is to pop off and make headlines and raise money for the next time they run. I was talking to one of our Republican senators not long ago, and this is someone who actually is very deeply entrenched in trying to fix some of our fiscal issues, and he was doing a head count in Washington of his Republican colleagues and figured out that probably only about 3 of them had ever read our current budget. 3. And that's on the Republican side. I can promise you the number's lower on the Democratic one. Think about that, though. It's really a stunning number. Alongside that, we've had a growing blur in the separation of powers. Congress, starting a couple decades ago, started abdicating its responsibility to actually write legislation that lays out exactly what should be done. Presidents, in the absence of that kind of prescription, decided to step into the gap and began ruling more via executive fiat. A federal bureaucracy then looked at all of those empty spaces and decided to fill in the gaps itself by writing its own rules and becoming a power unto itself. And this has become a really huge problem. We also have a federal government that has continued to grow in size and to take over many of the longtime responsibilities of the states. If you look back at Joe Biden's infrastructure bill, and for my many sins, I actually had to read the thing, it actually got so specific when it was talking about earmarks going back to states that it was laying out that X amount of money had to go to fill that pothole on that end of that street in that little town in America. We were not talking about the federal government funding interstate highways, people. Like, we were talking about a pure redistribution of federal taxpayer money going into DC, and then all of those guys dividing it back up and sending it back to do the traditional jobs that states normally do. Consequential laws that are supposed to govern the way Congress behaves and acts have failed to impose any order and then now are just routinely ignored, and yet nobody fixes them. An example, the 1974 Budget Act lays out that by September 30th of every year, Congress must, each chamber, pass its 12 appropriation bills, have met with each other, made a decision, and sent the funding for the next year's government operations to the president. In the time since that law was passed, 1974, 50 years ago, Congress has complied with it exactly 4 times. 1977, 1989, 1995, and the last time, 1997, meaning nearly 30 years ago. The last time it did its budget duties the way the law says it's supposed to. Nearly every other piece of legislation that Congress has passed over the past 100 years is failing as well, and nobody does anything about it. Social Security and Medicare, we know, are slowly going broke. Nobody fixes it. All of our welfare programs are on autopilot. Nobody does anything about it. The Endangered Species Act, another piece of legislation that was 50 years in, and I won't say the making, I'll say 50 years in the failing, has so far managed to fail to rescue 99.5% of all the species that it has ever put on its list. You might think that after 50 years, people would say, something's going on here. This isn't working. but nobody does anything about it. The National Environmental Protection Act, which is supposed to govern the way that we look at big projects and then mitigate against risks, just to do the best practices, has instead become this tool to make sure that we don't do any big infrastructure in the projects in the country, anywhere, at any time, because environmental groups sue and make sure they all get shut down. We have education policy that's a national disaster. Nobody does anything about it. We have a federal government that owns 50% of the western part of this country and largely exists to sit back and watch it burn to the ground every year. This is your federal government at work. The only thing Congress actually does manage to do these days is lock arms and spend everybody's money. That is the only thing it can agree on in a bipartisan manner anymore. And as we all know, that usually involves one time a year passing a 5,000-page omnibus bill that goes through Congress a couple of days before Christmas, right before the deadline, that nobody reads, and it funds the government for the next year at much higher levels than the year before. That and reconciliation bills of the type that we're seeing happen right now, the big beautiful bill in DC, because it's the only way a party that's in control can manage to pass something with just 51 votes in the Senate. Other than that, our esteemed lawmakers mostly spend their time patting each other on the back for renaming post offices. This is Washington these days, and this is one reason why we are very polarized. The last era that we had, where I would argue Washington worked even remotely the way it was supposed to work, and believe me, as a conservative, it really pains me to say this, was in the administration of Bill Clinton. Congress actually somewhat did its job back then. It took on welfare reform. It got serious about deficits. Clinton's reinvention of government, which some people forget actually did result in a reduction of the federal workforce. And that spirit of people working to get big things done did last until probably the first year of the George W. Bush administration. Although that is arguably, and this is a very damning observation, the very last time Congress really got together to deal on a bipartisan basis and fix some matter of big and pressing concern. In 2002, you will remember we passed that government reorganization law, which created the Department of Homeland Security and TSA after we had the 9/11 attacks. Also, that was the year that we passed No Child Left Behind, which, whatever you might think of that legislation these days, was a legitimate attempt by both sides to try to do something about education problems in the country. Ever since then, any piece of legislation that has passed of any consequence, and in that category I would maybe put Dodd-Frank and Obamacare, only passed on a partisan basis, one party deciding to jam it through, and was only able in those cases because Obama briefly had close to a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Even those two pieces of legislation happened 15 years ago. That's how long it's been since Congress has really solved a big problem. And while the American voters might not have, and God bless them that they don't, have all these numbers and facts floating around in their head the way I have to have them in mine, they all understand it. They get it. They know that something really big is broken in this country. They're sick and they're tired of it. And it's in that context that we have to look at some of our recent elections, and in particular the rise of Donald Trump. My father was a blue-collar automotive mechanic, also an entrepreneur. He ran a little automotive repair shop in Oregon, where I grew up. He was mostly a very astute observer of politics, and I will never forget him calling me back in the fall of 2015, very early in the Republican primary process at that time, and he said to me, complete with assurance, he's like, Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States. And I remember actually asking him, I was like, Dad, are you and Mom like experimenting with LSD late in life? Like, what's going on over there? Do I need to come home? And he's like, no. And here's what he said to me, and you're going to have to excuse my language because I'm being true to quote here. He said, I'm going to vote for him. Millions of people are going to vote for him because he means what he says. He doesn't care what the rest of them think, and he's going to make shit happen. And shit really needs to happen before it's too late. My dad sadly passed away from cancer not long after Trump was elected, but I sure wish he could have seen the last 4 months of this administration, because to re-quote him again, shit is really happening in Washington. In fact, so much is happening, so much day-to-day drama, which has been amplified by a very biased media, that the bigger story is getting missed. Trump's first term was consequential, right? I would say that probably 85–90% of it was a very Reagan-esque agenda, and he made some real progress on taxes, on deregulation, remaking the federal judiciary. But, and a lot of people forget this, that administration was exceptionally hobbled, especially in its first 2 years. Some of it was its own fault. Again, people forget this, but actually, Donald Trump's first campaign in his first year in office, it was a hot mess. Okay, nobody knew what was going on, and if you talk to some staff these days, they will acknowledge that they did spend the first 12 months just trying to find the bathrooms. Some of them actually never managed to do that, by the way. But it was very challenging. You had the Russia collusion hoax and a special counsel breathing down their neck, which really was destabilizing for the first couple of years that they got into office. Later, an impeachment inquiry, endless congressional investigations, lawsuits, the rise of lawfare, and then obviously the 2020 election. It was, I would say, an important and consequential presidential term, but not a groundbreaking presidential term. Here's the thing, though, to know and understand about Donald Trump, whether you like him or you don't like him. There are upsides and downsides to having, as a leader of the country, a man with one of the world's biggest egos. Biggest in the world. The downsides, we kind of get glimmers of it every day, and we all know what they are. My favorite, it kind of drives me nuts, is Donald Trump's habit of referring to himself in the third person, kind of like he's the queen. Sort of weird. But the other side, the upside, especially for those who voted for him and those who want to see change in the country, is that this guy, even when he lost the 2020 election, never doubted for 1 second that he was going to get elected again as president of the United States. Not for 1 second. And in those 4 years that he was out of office, not 1 minute of it was spent idly. He, within months, had tapped new people to begin to plan what he was going to do from day one when he got back for a second term, to analyze the mistakes that they had made in the first time around, and to make sure that none of that happened again. And the people doing this, by the way, they were not political lackeys or political hacks. These were people that had spent years as legal scholars and policy analysts and folks in the movement conservative troops out there. And they realized that they had an incredible opportunity, that if they got back into office for a second term, that they had a chance to not just do things like tax reform, but to attempt to restructure in really big ways the government in a way that they hoped would break this cycle of destruction and dysfunction that we see coming out of DC. Not little things like, a strategy for passing a surface transportation bill, but the really big things. How do we rein in the bureaucracy? What do we do about the endless growing power of the federal government? What do we do with these agencies that now operate somewhat separate from the presidency? How do we restore federalism? And especially, how do we do this? And this was another really smart thing they came up with. How do we do this alongside and utilizing the biggest triumph of Donald Trump's first term, which was his remaking of the federal judiciary? Knowing, as we know, that the Supreme Court has been willing to take on some really big issues, willing to go some places that courts have not been willing to go in the last 100 years, how do we factor that in to some of the things that we're going to try to do in Washington and provoke? So big, serious questions were underthought for 4 years, and no, those big, serious policy agendas are being enacted in DC. And that is the story that is getting missed. That is what is happening. Absorbing what this administration is doing can sometimes feel a little bit day-to-day like drinking from a fire hose. But this is the takeaway I would want you guys to bear in mind, is that there are much more consequential things happening in Washington than the day-to-day. And I want to give you some examples of that. Here's a really easy and obvious one, which I'm sure some of you have caught on to. We're finally having a serious discussion instead of just a, this is what Kim dreams about when she goes to bed at night, kind of conversation about the size and the scope of the federal government. Whether we really need entire departments and agencies that now have become fixtures in DC, and whether a lot of these federal duties shouldn't also be handed back to the states. Donald Trump, within days of taking office, put out an executive order announcing his intention to wind down the Department of Education. Okay? And I say, yahoo, personally. For nearly all of this nation's history, education was the exclusive province of the states for really obvious reasons. There never had been any need for the federal government to be involved. This was a reality that was pretty much acknowledged by everyone in the United States right up until the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And any of you who know that history know that the Department of Education even then was not created to fulfill a need, but rather to pay off the teachers' unions who endorsed him for the presidency. It was a political gift, and it has remained a political gift, largely for the teachers' unions. It certainly has not done anything to help better educate our children, and if anyone disagrees, I would just point you to the nation's report cards, which continue to get worse and worse. Blunt reality is that the Department of Education remains a federal body that exists to make sure that there's perpetual employment for the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Over the last 40 years, our Department of Education has nonetheless spent $3 trillion on federal education. And the acknowledgement that that is not working can be witnessed already out at the state level, where one of the most exciting things that's ever happened in my life working for free markets and free people is spreading across the states in terms of school choice. The number of states that have now adopted that is absolutely nothing short of remarkable. Trump's education secretary, Linda McMahon, is deadly serious when she talks about her job of actually shutting down the Department of Education. She continues to refer to her role as engaging in the Department of Education's final mission. Right now, she's been calling to end a lot of the grant money that gets handed out, and what remains of it to hand out in block grants, because it is important. There are certain things that the Department of Education has come to fund, in particular programs for students with learning disabilities, etc., that I think a lot of Americans, even if they didn't agree with having an Department of Education, might still want to keep flowing to the states. But there are ways to do that. You can do that with a block grant. It could be handed out via a different agency. Do you really need an entire bureaucracy? Beyond that, to hand some money back to the states to assist them with their own education priorities. Now, are we going to ultimately need Congress at some point to make the final decision to shut this down? Yes, absolutely. They created the Department of Education. They would need to shut the Department of Education. But simply having this debate again, having a debate about whether or not we need a department in Washington is thrilling. When the Department of Education was first created, Republicans talked about shutting it down for about 10 years and then they forgot about it. Or they just figured it was too hard to do. But we are now having that discussion. And I love the idea that maybe we can be adjusting to the thought that the world will not end if we shut down a department of the federal government. And it's not just the education department. A lot of people might not know this. The federal government has an estimated 2,000 organizations. 2,000. Departments, agencies, commissions, boards, panels, institutes. This administration is going through every one of them at the moment. Some of them, they are actually reducing their funding level to the minimum and just one staff member because they can't get rid of it again without congressional approval. But I would like to hope that 4 years from now, we will as a nation step back and say, wow, the clocks didn't stop because that agency wasn't functioning, or wow, the world did not end because this thing has not been funded for 4 years. Maybe take a deep breath and begin the process of rationalizing the federal government more long term. Here's another one, which gets to the deep thought that went into the initial moves of this administration. Some of you may have noticed the headlines. I think it was hard to ignore them because a lot of them were screaming headlines. When Trump in his opening days announced that he was summarily and with no notice going to fire the heads of several independent agencies, in particular the chair of the National Labor Relations Board, despite a congressional law saying that he can only do that if she engaged in malfeasance or a neglect of her duty. And of course, all the headlines went bananas and said Trump was breaking the law, etc., and so on. Here's the thing. Donald Trump can't actually read the law, and his lawyers could read the law. They knew exactly what they were doing. They purposely took this action because their argument is you're not breaking the law if the law itself is unconstitutional. And so they purposely fired her because they knew it would provoke a lawsuit, and that lawsuit is now going. It's already landed at the Supreme Court, and it's going to pose for the first time a question that has been lingering over this country for 100 years. We are finally going to get a Supreme Court that looks at a question that's been ignored for 100 years. And this is the question. Congress, starting back in the New Deal era, got the agency bug. It started creating all these bodies to administer different parts of the economy, things like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the NLRB, the Federal Housing Administration, all the alphabet soup. Now, some of these agencies were actually put under direct presidential authority, saying that the president gets to nominate who runs them, and the president can fire that person if they're not doing the right job. But some of these agencies, in fact a huge number of them, Congress decided that they didn't really want them to actually have to report to the president. Instead, they would report to Congress. And they called these independent agencies. And the argument behind them is that the commissioners on them would need to be above politics, and they would need to deal with things in a nonpartisan way. And the only way to do that was to make sure an administration could not interfere with their duties. And that's where you get all of these boards where they have set terms and rotating chairmanships, et cetera, and so on. Back then, back when we used to have these very healthy debates 100 years ago, there was actually complaints about these independent agencies and some lawsuits saying, whoa, 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 you can't have people running around Washington engaged in executive-like functions that don't report to the executive branch. This is called separation of powers. And the Supreme Court took a case, and 100 years ago came up with a decision called Humphrey's Executor, and it came up with a really clever little way of justifying them. It said, well, yeah, these organizations do have some powers, but they're not traditional executive functions. And therefore, we argue that you can have independent agencies that are not responsible to the executive branch. We're now going to have this debate again. The Supreme Court itself, over the years, has cast a lot of shade on its previous rulings, arguing that maybe that was the case back then, but we all know that it's nuts now. Many of these agencies do all the things that the executive branch do. They issue rules, they issue fines, they put forward injunctions, they settle disputes. These are classic executive branch authority positions. So I think we're going to get, I think that it's going to be reversed. And that's going to be enormous. Think about that for just a minute, what that would mean. Independent agencies where you have the heads that previously, or up until now, as is the current situation, can kind of rule whatever they want. And sometimes the President of the United States can do nothing about it. We would have a situation where all agencies in Washington are now subject to some sort of executive authority. There's going to be a lot of screaming if that is what happens, but I believe that constitutionally, this is a really healthy thing. We should all be thrilled that this is going on. Another big legal question. Trump came into office and decided to not spend some of the money that Congress had already appropriated. And the bets are is that the administration is likewise teeing up another lawsuit over another enormous unresolved question in that balance between the executive and the legislative branch. When Congress passes appropriations, the question is, are those appropriations a floor? Must the president spend every last dollar that they passed out the door? Or is that appropriation a ceiling? Meaning if the president thinks that some of that spending is unnecessary, can he save taxpayer dollars? There's another word for this. It's called impoundment. It's never been resolved. In fact, it was headed for the Supreme Court back in the 1970s when Richard Nixon tried impoundment and Congress didn't like it. But Congress was so worried it might lose that lawsuit that it passed that 1974 Budget Control Act, and it came up with a little compromise, as it were. It said, well, if you don't like some of the spending we did, you can send it back to us in the form of a rescission. We still get to vote on whether or not it goes out the door. We're the final say, but let's come up with this compromise. Russ Vought, who is the President Trump's budget director, has been studying this as a constitutional issue for about 15 or 20 years. He's convinced the president does have some impoundment authority, but another decision that is headed, another huge case that is headed to the Supreme Court, which could fundamentally restructure the way we spend money in this country. And can we just acknowledge that if you look at our debt, we clearly need to be thinking hard about what we need to do to fix that situation. Speaking of separation of powers, we're also finally having a big important discussion about the actual power behind the throne these days, the more than 2 million strong federal bureaucracy. This force that essentially runs everything, are accountable to no one, and cannot be fired. One of the biggest aspects of this is DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. I know it's been getting some ugly headlines recently since Elon Musk decided to go back to the private sector, and given that he didn't come anywhere close, at least so far, to accomplishing his initial goal of cutting $2 trillion. But I disagree with anyone who says that this has not been a very healthy and cleansing exercise. DOGE has been reminding Americans that our federal government simply is broken in many, many important ways. Thanks to DOGE, we've discovered that we are handing out small business loans to children who have not yet been born, that we have for the last 65 years been using a mine underground in Pennsylvania to fill out all of our retirement papers, which are done in triplicate by hand on paper. Months that take, or applications, each one that takes months to fulfill. They are then stored, 400 million individual records, in 26,000 file cabinets underground, 180 feet underground, in a mine in Pennsylvania. And after DOGE came in, it told Trump's Office of Personnel Management that they needed to go digital. For the first time in the history of the federal government, just a couple of weeks ago, the Office of Personnel Management filled out its first federal employee retirement paperwork online and did it in 1 day. 1 day. I want you to think about what a mess that is, and then just assume it's happening millions of times over in the federal government every day. Having that exposed is really, really important. Also on these employees, as you know, we are finally engaging in some reductions in the federal workforce. People looking around saying, do we really, really need all of these folks? Sometimes those cuts are very big, but if you look at some of the information that has been brought out by DOGE, it's clearly necessary. My favorite information that I found so far was that the Internal Revenue Service has 1,400 employees, whose only job it was to hand out laptops and cell phones to the rest of the IRS. 1,400 people. I grew up in a town with 600 people. I mean, it's really nice work if you can get it, but I think we really need to think this through. And in reality, when you think about that federal workforce, it has been, since Jimmy Carter's era, that we have approached anything close to a civil service reform. Those fixes are also being discussed by this administration, trying to figure out how to take all this power that right now is sitting in the hands of people that none of us know we didn't elect, and who are writing all of the rules and regulations, managing all of this dysfunction in government, and have no responsibility when things go wrong, how to make sure that that power is put back in the legislative branch and in the executive branch proper. And so many other big questions. We're having discussions about the border, America's sovereignty, the outer limits of a president's authority to enforce immigration law. We are watching federal agencies hand out waivers to the states to allow them to innovate on some of the programs that they work jointly on with the federal government, whether it be food stamps or Medicaid. We're seeing a return of government looking to partner with and outsource jobs to a private sector that is better suited to do a lot of those jobs. Just one example I can name is our space program, for instance. We have 3 fascinating new heads of departments, the heads of Energy, Interior, and the Environmental Protection Agency. I just journeyed with all 3 of them up to the north of Alaska to go look at the pipeline project up there. Chris Wright, Doug Burgum, and Lee Zeldin, fascinating guys. They are, for the first time, probably since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, looking at all of our federal lands, which, may I note, probably is the biggest, most bountiful, most enviable land portfolio anywhere in the world, and asking questions as to how we somehow managed to take that asset and lose billions of dollars on it every year instead of making something from it. I mean, these are just really fundamental questions. And you might ask me, why are you focusing on all this instead of the immediate big issues of the day? And well, one obviously is Chautauqua. I think I'm supposed to talk about really big stuff here, right? No, I mean, it's mostly because we have a tendency as human beings to only talk about the immediate issue, the immediate problem. And those immediate issues are never, in fact, going to get solved in beneficial ways until we address these bigger problems that get in the way of those fixes. We have to fix the structural problems behind anything to begin to contemplate how you fix the smaller questions. The reason our nation has been so exceptional since its birth has been because it was born out of men, our founders, who cared deeply about those big questions. I was just talking to you about the separation of powers, federalism, the role of the executive, the role of the legislative branch. And they understood, and they set up a constitution that would require us to continue having those debates about these big questions. We haven't done that in way too long, and it is extremely exciting that we are finally doing it again, and I'm very hopeful that it's going to make a change. 2, because I think too much of our public discourse these days is doom and gloom, and you want to leave this feeling, I want you to leave this feeling here energized that we are again going to be tackling some really big issues. I think that optimism is so important because I don't hear it from most people these days, and most worrisome to me as someone who has teenagers, I don't hear it from a younger generation. Few things concern me more than talking to my own teenagers and their peers, and they don't have the optimism I had as a kid. They're very concerned that things are fundamentally broken and that they're not going to have the opportunities that our generation is. And finally, I just want you to be thinking about all of this because knowledge really is power. And if you are here at this lecture, it's because you care about our body politic, our civil society, you are informing yourself, and you want to make some changes. Too often, we do not realize we are living in important moments until we look back on it years later. You are living in a political moment, and it offers some immense opportunities. The big questions that are being resurrected in DC are an opening for you to re-engage in all of them, to innovate on them, to bring them to your own local communities, to your own organizations, to spread them to others who haven't considered them yet. The beating heart of a healthy republic really is an informed and spirited and active body politic. That is all of you. So I'm just urging you, think big. A lot big is going on. Be happy that you are seeing it. Take advantage of it and make this country a better place than what you found it. Thank you. You got Oh, I can do that. I'm good. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. I knew you would. Anyway, now I got a question. What's the bigger threat to the founding of the United States of America? China, Russia, or our own deep state?
Well, I'm not trying to dodge that. Did everyone hear that question? Yeah. Okay. I'm not actually trying to dodge that. But I think that to actually suggest that one is more scary than the other suggests that we cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. And we must, as a country, be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. What happened, I would argue, over this weekend was one of the most important things this country has done since prior to Barack Obama being elected, that sent a message of deterrence in the world and tried to resurrect our deterrence capability in the world. To me, my big question right now is not just what Iran is thinking, but what China and Russia are thinking. And I think that that was a good message that they got sent this weekend.
Thank you. I'm an advocate for families and children with special needs. What should I tell them? They're terrified that if the Department of Education disappears, their children are going to lose their services because their states are not going to pick up those services.
Yes, so that was one of the things I was mentioning. I do not think that cutting down the Department of Education, ending the Department of Education, necessarily has to mean an end to some federal funding to the states. The problem we have with DOE at the moment is that most of its money gets handed out in grants, competitive grants. And so what ends up happening is all of these school districts across the country hire a lot more people who only exist to write federal grant applications. If any of you have ever worked in public schools, and I was a volunteer, I was PTO president for 10 years, God. And there's entire levels, there's statistics on this, entire levels of mid-level employees who do not engage in teaching at all. They simply engage to deal with paperwork to try to get this federal money. There's no reason. IDEA is a very important program, and every Republican I have talked to in Washington thinks that money needs to continue to go to the states. It's just that they want to hand it out in a block grant and let the states figure out how to use it themselves.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for a most interesting, well-presented presentation.
Thank you.
Personally, I'm very concerned about the loss of jobs in America and the fact that we're importing so much more than we're exporting. Part of it seems to be that foreign countries are dumping trash cash, basically manipulating our currency. What can be done about it? So we restore 3 to 5 million jobs, well-paid, middle-class jobs.
So this is trade. And look, I look at the trade issue a little bit different than some people do because I'm a big fan of free trade. But I think there is no question that is a legitimate and huge problem, all right? And I think that there's a couple of ways, if you acknowledge that it's a problem, there's a couple of ways that you can go about fixing it. One of them is the way Donald Trump is going about putting tariffs on all of these other countries. There are huge problems with that in my mind because it often leads to retaliatory trade measures, and often Americans end up paying the price for those not just our own tariffs on foreign goods, but the retaliatory tariffs that end up coming on our producers, who then can't get their things to other markets, okay? So that's a huge problem. Also, I'd like to remind everybody, why do we have trade, okay? It's because we don't cover all of Florida in sugarcane or rubber plants, right? I mean, we can make that decision if we want to and just get rid of everything else we have in Florida so that we can make all of our own rubber so that we don't have to import any of it from India. But the entire idea behind trade is that some countries have a competitive advantage in certain products that they make over other countries, and we all benefit as a world if we are trading on those balances. So, in my mind, the better way we get rid of this, why do we not have the manufacturing we used to have in this country? It's because we kill our manufacturers with rules and regulations and minimum wage obligations and all of these things. I'm not saying get rid of all environmental protections, obviously, but there has to be, and taxes, by the way. Everybody understands the corporate tax rate is paid by all of you, okay? It's a nonsense tax. Corporations do not pay the corporate tax rate. They just pass it on to you, or they pass it on to employees in terms of lower hourly wages. None of this is healthy. So I would prefer to see an administration that were aggressively cutting tax punishment on corporations, punishments on companies trying to bring money back to the United States, trying to slash regulations in huge and dramatic ways that finally allow us to create our stuff at a reasonable price and jobs alongside it.
You mentioned school choice, and everyone for school choice is very excited to pass, but I'm curious to know how we're going to meet that need, and I'm wondering if you're aware of any conversations of the private sector talking about starting schools or anything, because I'm just wondering how that need's going to be met when parents start choosing that.
Do you mean just having enough slots for all the students?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so look, you bring up a really important point. We're seeing all of these states pass school choice. I think it's so exciting. You know, the big one was just Texas, just created the largest school choice in the nation by an amount of money that it's put into it. But that's the point, is that they have so many kids in Texas, the actual vouchers that they are giving are limited to a relatively, even though that number is huge, the number of private educational scholarships they can offer is still quite limited. States at a certain point are going to have to make a decision about whether or not they don't, right now they're doing school choice as an added, as an extra. They haven't wanted to touch public education dollars. At a certain point, they're going to have to look at the success of these programs, and if a majority of parents prefer to choose other options, they're going to have to truly free up that education budget to follow parents into the schools where they need them to go. It's going to be unsustainable to attempt to do it, to just continue adding to a program while still paying for the existing public funding system. And yes, private sectors will pay some too. I think that there's a lot more excitement and some money to be made, and so I think that there's that option as well.
Kimberly, love you and love Potomac Watch.
Thank you.
You're a great writer. Thanks for coming down from Anchorage to Little Chautauqua. Hopefully you come back next year. I have been a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal for 50 years, and I've become very disappointed with it over the last couple of years. You can find literal dribble in 1,000 other publications, but don't mess with the Wall Street Journal. So what's going on, and do you have any influence over the
You know, every time I go to an event, my husband and I make bets. Will I get out of the room without somebody asking the question you just asked? I always lose that bet. First of all, for any of you who don't know, there is an absolute iron divide between the editorial page and the news site. We do not have any interaction with each other in any way. We have entirely different staffs, entirely different bosses, and so I don't exert any influence over that. I will say this, I mean, first of all, I think the Wall Street Journal editorial page has been consistent for all of our existence, where we have served under the motto, free markets and free people, that we are as dedicated to that every day as we have ever been. And I get to watch that put into practice. I sit on the editorial board, so not only do I write my column and do TV and podcasts, but I help write some of our editorials. I'm involved in all of our editorial board decisions and conversations. And that is our only focus every day, free markets, free people. The news side, I still would argue, is the best newspaper you are going to get in the country.
Kimberly, every time you get a chance to see a Democrat congressman or senator talk about the illegal aliens. They say they talk about due process all the time. Can you tell us what the Constitution really says about whether they get or deserve due process?
Right, so I think this is such an important question because there's been a lot of confusion about this. First of all, just think about what those words mean. All due process means that there has to be a process, right? And it has to be the process that is due that particular circumstance. And those circumstances can be different in very different categories, right? So it simply is the case, there is a level of due process that is higher for a US citizen than there is for many, many classes of migrants who are in this country, either with work visas or without work visas, those who have claimed asylum, who are waiting for a hearing, they've already been assigned a hearing, those that have been given notification that they might have a hearing, those that that came over with no papers and that are clearly here illegally, having never alerted authorities to the fact that they were here. And also, there's an entirely different class of migrants that have come over the border, which Donald Trump expanded the category that this covered when he first got into office. It used to be that you had the ability to deport a migrant to the United States if they had come within the last, I think, month and were within 100 miles of the border. I think he has now expanded that category for the last year and anywhere in the United States. So there are different processes. I couldn't go through all of them for you, but my point being is that due process is different for every one of those categories that exist. It simply means there is a process that must be put into place. It usually involves some sort of legal consideration, but not necessarily always in the federal judiciary. Sometimes it can be done within special immigration forums where we have administrative councils and judges that have been set up to just deal with immigration issues. They're not part of the federal judiciary. Due process is really important. I just would note this though, like I don't think we should ever give up on that principle in general. By the way, due process is what would make sure that if you were accidentally swept up in one of these big raids, they would check to make sure that you weren't supposed to be deported. That's a good thing, right? There are other countries that would just sweep you up and put you in jail and not bother to look at any of your papers. It's one of the things that makes us really a very different nation. But you are correct that not all immigrants, in fact, few immigrants, are entitled to the exact same due process standards that American citizens are.
Thank you for coming. A couple questions. As long as I've been alive, I've read books and heard pundits talk about the importance of reducing the deficit. Questions on how important is it to reduce the deficit, and from a balanced perspective, if it is important, what's your best advice to whomever on the revenue side and the expense side to get there in the next 20 years? Last question would be, what's your favorite type of Alaskan salmon?
That's easy.
Those questions are for Madam President, okay?
By the way, can we all congratulate Paul on his masterful handling of the microphone? I wouldn't want to mess with you. I'm going to bring you up to my house to deal with my teenage daughters. So, by the way, as we talk about the big, beautiful bill, this is one of my biggest frustrations. It is pathetic what the Republican Congress is doing right now. Can I just say that for the record? Pathetic. Okay? I mean, we have raised our average federal spending since COVID about 50% more a year annually. 50% more. We are at 50% higher average spending every year than we were in fiscal 2019. You cannot tell me that if we went back to fiscal 2019 levels that this country would collapse. We were doing pretty okay prior to COVID hitting. Even then, I would argue that our spending was way too high. The problem that we have right now is that we have members of Congress who only care about funneling money back to their districts. right? And like, for instance, a big part of some of the spending problem we had over the last couple of years were that infrastructure bill that we passed, which, by the way, most of it was not on big, beautiful infrastructure. It was fixing potholes back in people's districts. Okay, it was setting up new green charging stations for the electric vehicles you were all about to be made to buy. It wasn't doing fixing bridges, etc. And also that semiconductor chips bill, that was just handouts to Intel and all of these different semiconductor companies, which we claimed somehow was helping us from a national security perspective, suggesting that they wouldn't have built their factories here if we hadn't given them that money. But we just talked about other ways that you can encourage people to invest here that don't involve cutting them enormous $100 billion checks, okay? But now that we're faced with it, they have, the sky is the limit with this reconciliation bill. They could be cutting trillions and trillions. They could bring all of us back to 2019 levels, but we won't do it. Why? We don't want to be the people that now take a single dollar back away from Medicaid. We don't want to be the people that claw back any of those green subsidies because they're good for, you know, the windmill producers in my state and the solar power companies in my state. So it's entirely a Republican lack of will. The only way this really changes is if you have a president who makes an absolute priority out of this, the top priority. And I don't think Donald Trump is willing to do that. So that's kind of an issue. Maybe as he goes along, if he gets a couple of legislative wins, he might double down on that. He certainly has people around him who are very worried about this and want to see, like Russ Vought, the head of the budget office, he would love nothing more than to cut the size of the federal government in half. So there are people that are trying to do it. But I think until you do that, and until we start electing people, like, those are the questions that need to get asked in the town hall, is, are you willing to cut government spending even if it's for this district? Because right now, Republicans think that the only way to get elected is to funnel dollars back home. And, you know, until we send the message that we'd actually like them to fix some of the structural problems instead of just rerouting money back to the states, we're not going to get a better class of legislators who deal with that. Either that or we default, and then game on. And that's not unlikely. There's a real possibility that happens. Or at least that we have a very scary moment in the markets that maybe finally puts people on the C Straight program. So.
Thank you.
Oh,